The Grand Rebel. Part 1. Childhood and Youth. Chapter 1. The family of Shivaji claimed a double descent both from King Porus and from the Ranas of Udaipur. Porus, it will be remembered, was the Indian king who opposed Alexander. This claim would appear to have been made in the same spirit as the boast of the Julian house of royal Trojan descent. Alexander has always exercised a strange fascination over the imagination of Indians. In Balochistan today, stout chieftains with turbans as large as those of ballet sultans in a buck's decor will solemnly assure you that Alexander passed through their village sometime last century, adding as if with a real effort to be accurate, quote, I cannot quite remember him myself. I was only a child. End of quote. So, in the absence of any evidence, one cannot but agree with the judicious Mr. Ome in his pronouncement. Quote, the descent of the Chittor Rajas from Porus, although asserted by European travelers, does not seem to be established. The claim of relationship with the House of Udaipur has, on the other hand, not been contested except by enemies of Shivaji and appears to have been accepted by contemporaries. The family name of Bhosle is said to be derived from the fief of Bhosavat in Udaipur, whence a prince named Sajan Singh fled after the first Mussalman conquest of Udaipur to seek his fortune as a soldier of fortune in the south. As mercenaries, the Bhosles settled in the Maratha country, hiring their swords to one or other of the Mussalman princes who ruled there. In theory, all Mohammedan India owed allegiance to the Emperor of Delhi. The dynasties at Delhi changed. Emperors rose from as various races as in the later Roman Empire. But after what I might call the bull of sovereignty obtained by Muhammad Tughlaq from the Caliph of Baghdad, the emperor at Delhi was nominally overlord of India. In fact, however, outlying provinces were always more or less independent, and the tyranny of Muhammad Tughlaq, the Tsar Pal I of India, provoked a wide rebellion in southern India, where a new dynasty known as the Bahmani established itself. The relations between the Bahmani kingdom and the empire were not unlike those between Eastern and Western Europe after the suppression of the Roman Principate in Italy. The Basileus might temporarily acquiesce in the usurpation of Ostrogoth and Visigoth in the western provinces, but a Justinian would seize a favorable opportunity to reassert not only imperial claims but the reality of imperial power. The throne of Delhi was for 2 centuries occupied by weak rulers, and there were periods of anarchy enlivened by the massacres of Tamerlane. To this condition, the Bahmani kingdom offered as favorable a contrast as Italy under Theodoric to the Balkans under Anastasius. But just as the Gothic kingdoms crumbled away while Byzantium emerged refreshed and vigorous under new strong dynasties, so the Bahmani kingdom broke up into 5 comparatively weak states: Golconda, Bijapur, Ahmednagar, Berar, and Bidar. While the throne of Delhi was, in 1526, occupied by Babur, the first of the great Mughal dynasty. None of the 5 kingdoms of the south was a match for the military power of the revived empire. These kingdoms had passed in their mutual hostilities to unite against the last Hindu state of the south, that of Vijayanagar, and to destroy it utterly. In spite, however, of the lengthening shadow of the great Mughal, Their unity was short lived, and while Berar was absorbed in the empire without serious resistance, Bidar was conquered and annexed by Bijapur. There remained then three kingdoms: Golconda, Bijapur, and Ahmednagar. Shivaji's grandfather, Maloji, a soldier of fortune like all his ancestors since their flight from Udaipur, chose to offer his sword to the king of Ahmednagar. He was received with favor and married the sister of a prominent courtier. In 1594, Shahaji, Shivaji's father, was born. At the Ahmednagar court, there were many Maratha officials, and chief among them was a wealthy landowner called Lakhoji, who was the leading personage in the Hindu community in the city. On the occasion of any great festival, he would throw open his house and grounds to his fellow Hindus. In the spring of 1599, they were celebrating Holi, the Hindu festival of spring, in Lakhoji's house. Dancing boys with bells at their ankles stamped their feet in time round the courtyard of the house and chanted hymns to the spirits of fertility, while trumpets and fifes played cheerfully. The guests chased each other, shouting and laughing and sprinkling colored water over each other's bright clothes, for such horseplay is traditional at this festival. Generally, the children sat solemn eyed against the carved pillars of the arcade that ran round three sides of the courtyard and wonderingly watched the unusual levity of their parents, an odd departure from the formality and gravity of Hindu life. And gravity of Hindu life. On this occasion, however, Jijabai, the 5 year old daughter of the host, began to mimic the grown up guests' high spirited games and ran about sprinkling people with colored water. Young Shahaji, Young Shahaji imitated her and splashed water over the girl's dress of green and white. Soon, the two children had drenched each other's clothes. As they stood laughing, bright eyed and flushed, Lakhoji passed and was moved at their happiness. What a charming couple, he said. Maloji, ambitious and unscrupulous, at once called the attention of everyone present to his host's exclamation, which he interpreted as a proposal to betroth the two children. Such early betrothals, which do not necessarily imply marriage till many years later, or even if the marriage ceremony is performed, the couple return to their own homes till they reach a proper age to live together, are common enough in India, and Hindu etiquette is very strict on the fulfillment of all promises of betrothal. Lakhoji, as the chief Hindu noble at the Ahmednagar court, would not have dreamed of betrothing his daughter to the son of a soldier of fortune. He was appalled at the meaning read into his light words. He tried to laugh the matter off, but next morning Maloji sent him a formal request to confirm his proposal. Lakhoji refused, and Maloji, professing indignation at the insult, challenged him to a duel. The king of Ahmednagar heard of the quarrel. He did not want to lose either Lakhoji, a loyal noble, or Maloji, a capable soldier. So with the ami- sorry, so with the amiable caprice of a sultan, he raised Maloji to the command of 5,000 horse and gave him a fief. If still unequal in rank and wealth to Lakhoji, Maloji was now at least a person of substance, and pressed by the king, Lakhoji gave way and allowed his daughter Jijabai to be formally betrothed, and after 5 or 6 years married to young Shahaji. 3 or 4 years later, they began to live together, and presently Jijabai had a son called Sambhaji. Shahaji followed his father in the service of Ahmednagar. However, in 1636, that kingdom collapsed and Shahaji enlisted in the armies of Bijapur. His possession of the fief granted to his father was reaffirmed by his new master. Now, of the five original Muhammadan states of South India, only Golconda and Bijapur remained, both theoretically feudatories of the emperor at Delhi, but in practice independent. To translate his nominal overlordship into real authority, the Emperor Shah Jahan, having annexed most of the territories that till recently formed part of the Ahmadnagar kingdom, pressed southwards to attack Bijapur. Shahaji's lands, granted to his father Maloji, lay in the path of the imperial advance. He resisted for a while and then rode southwards to Bijapur, taking with him his baby son Sambhaji, but abandoning not only his lands but also his wife Jijabai, who was again pregnant. Chapter 2. Jijabai took refuge in Shivner, a fort in the hill country. A few faithful retainers manned the half-ruined bastions. Beyond the walls stretched panther-haunted woods and melancholy wastes of jungle, and in the mornings when the gates were cautiously opened and a file of women went down through the mist to fill their jars with fresh water from a spring, they would notice the tracks of bears clear in the red soil. A wild and lonely place, and Jijabai must often have contrasted her father's comfortable mansion with the poor cottage where she now lived, and the narrow limits of the fort from whose gates you could not venture far for fear of brigands and wild beasts. But there was less to fear here than in the plains below, where the armies of the empire and Bijapur contended, disputing each mile of that frontier tract. The soldiers of both armies were mercenaries and largely foreigners: Arabs, Pathans, Turks, Afghans, and Africans. Their pay often in arrears, they hunted down the Hindu peasantry, destroyed the crops, carried off the cattle and the women and boys without caring to which ruler their victims professed allegiance. The land went out of cultivation and the surviving peasants became bandits. Happy in her temporary security, Jijabai prepared for the birth of her child. She was very religious and carefully followed all the Hindu rites prescribed for pregnant women. She drew triangles adorned with vermilion bosses on the walls of her cottage and anointed them daily with honey and molasses and melted butter in honor of the mother goddess. While the fort garrison anxiously scanned the line of hills, sorry, while the fort garrison anxiously scanned the lines of hills, sorry, while the fort garrison anxiously sorry, while the fort garrison anxiously scanned the line of hills, Jijabai was strangely content. In dreams, she heard voices prophesying fame for her child as yet unborn. She was not the only person in India then exercised by similar premonitions. There were curious rumors in the far south where the memory of Hindu independence was more recent and the hope of a Hindu revival not yet dead. India has always been notable for the mysterious way in which rumors and warnings travel with lightning like rapidity from village to village. The chapati messages, or sorry, the chapati messages just before the mutiny will be remembered. And a few months before Shivaji's birth, an odd prophecy was repeated in the villages of the south, a Sanskrit verse: "The time of deliverance is at hand. Maidens herald it with songs of joy, and the heavens shower blossoms on the earth." On April 16th, 1627, Jijabai gave birth to a second son whom she called Shivaji. The ceremonies at the birth of a Hindu man-child are as numerous as at all other occasions in the drama of Hindu life. But the chief actor in them is the father. But the father who should have been standing by the sorry, but the father who should have been standing by the couch of Jijabai and her son was far away. The room, darkened with drawn shutters, must have grown hot with the purifying fires, in whose uncertain light the watching faces of priests were sometimes startlingly clear and sometimes veiled in gloom. And as Jijabai lay silent and at rest after the pain, she perhaps felt with new sorrow the absence of her husband and her helpless loneliness. Some other man must have deputized for Shahaji, and in accordance with Hindu ritual, laid the man child in a winnowing fan, kissed its head in blessing, and let honey fall through a gold ring upon the child's mouth. Sometime after the birth ceremonies, sorry, sometime after the birth ceremonies, come what, there being no European equivalent, I might call the profession testing. The child is laid on a carpet, and before him are spread symbols of the various professions, a pen for a clerk, a sword for a soldier, and so forth, so that the child, by pointing to one or other of these symbols, may indicate what profession his parents should prepare for him. His parents should prepare him for. One can hazard the guess that Shivaji's fingers strayed in the direction of the sword, even if the discreet pressure of a priest's hand never urged him, as so often happens at such ceremonies, towards the symbol of that occupation which would be seemly for the child's rank and caste. Meanwhile, the Mughal commander was still searching for Shahaji, for till the local landowners had been rounded up and forced into formal submission to the emperor, the district could not be considered properly conquered. But, but when it was learned that Shahji had left the district and was safe in Bijapur city, they began to hunt for his wife and child. The earliest words that Shivaji heard must have been of anxiety and fear, for the fort where his mother had taken refuge could never stand a regular siege, and the only hope was that the Mughal patrols might not know where Jijabai was. A childhood passed in alternating alarm and relief. And then, when Shivaji was 6, the blow fell. We do not know whether the secret of Jijabai's hiding place was betrayed to the Mughals by some tribesman corrupted by a bribe, or whether they learnt of her refuge by chance. All we know is that while Jijabai was captured, the Mughals never found Shivaji. Perhaps the alarm was given in time for a servant to snatch up the child and dart from the back gates of the fort into the jungle, while Jijabai gained time by arguing with her captors. The Mughal headquarters were then at Trimbak, a spot especially holy to Hindus. Sorry. The Mughal headquarters were then at Trimbak, a spot especially holy. Sorry. The Mughal headquarters were then at Trimbak, a spot especially holy to Hindus, for in the vast black cliff that overhangs the town is a spring where the sacred Godavari rises. Today it is an enchanting place. Black stone temples of a simple grandeur, jacaranda trees blooming in temple courtyards, a stream running down the main street of the town, overhung with trees and crossed by high carved bridges. But when Jijabai came in a palanquin surrounded by Mughal troopers through the white throne gates of the town, the houses were in ruins and the streets empty. Jijabai must have felt her heart with sorry. Jijabai must have felt her heart wither in despair. They had caught her. They must inevitably find her son. The Mughal commander was more human than many, but his humanity was born of indifference. Jijabai's only value to him would have been as a hostage. and perhaps he knew that Shahaji, away in Bijapur, had taken another wife. But the child was another matter. Capture the son, and the father would come to heal. He ordered the patrols in the hills to redouble their efforts. Jijabai was sent under guard to a fortress. For 3 years, devoted servants carried Shivaji with them in the recesses of the hills, pursued by the Mughals. Even today, these hills are a wild labyrinth of narrow passes between huge cliffs where the air is stifling and damp, of rolling uplands where the yellow spear grass stabs one's ankles and the leafless shrubs seem to crouch, tightly gripping the shallow pebble strewn soil, of endless avenues through the luxuriant forest, under one's feet a carpet of rotting leaves squelching at every step, and all round the suspense of breathless noon. Bitter the winter in those hills, a thick mist clinging about the trees almost till noon, so that even the hillmen come out into the daylight like chill, numbed flies, slowly stretching their aching limbs in the sun. In May come the long rains. At first, a few showers, pleasant after parching drought. A thick mist in the ravines, while in the darkening woods, the coppersmith bird hoots menacingly in warning of the approaching storm. Red clouds climbing the sky, a hush and sense of tension. And then, with the first outburst of thunder, trees bend and scream under a sea bitter wind, and the rain falls in hard white rods that beat the grass flat and send rocks hurtling down precipices and sound upon cottage roofs like a clamor of kettle drums. Through winter and monsoon and short, breathless summer, the fugitives wandered in the hills, never daring to rest long under any roof, always in constant anxiety. It would be difficult to exaggerate the effect on the child's mind of these 3 years. While most well to do Hindus had come to accept Muslim domination as inevitable and had been seduced by the luxury and comfort of Muhammadan courts, Shivaji spent his earlier childhood among men not yet subdued, among wild tribesmen, and in lonely forest villages. Other young Hindus of his rank lived as neighbors with Mohammedan gentry, and if they were despised and sometimes persecuted, they accepted such inconveniences without too much complaint. But to Shivaji, the Mohammedans were the people who had taken his mother away and who followed him relentlessly, the ogres of his childhood. When he was 10, his mother escaped from her fortress, but we do not know any details of the manner of her escape. She joined her son in the hills. She can hardly have hoped to see him again. In the loneliness of her imprisonment, she had turned increasingly to religion for comfort, and the reunion with her son must have seemed almost a miraculous answer to her prayers. The war between the empire and Bijapur sorry, was drawing wearily to its end, and the Mughals abandoned their search for Shivaji. Glad of the respite, mother and son lived together in some cottage in the hills. Shivaji never forgot listening to his mother while she told him of the old glories of Hinduism and how her family and his father's had been free and noble even before the coming of the Greeks in days when Hindustan was the land of the Hindus indeed. Meanwhile, envoys passed between Delhi and Bijapur. The Emperor Shah Jahan, finding in his old age greater pleasure in music and in graceful dances than in the dreary details of campaigns, was weary of the war. His secretaries wrote letters couched in the proper terms of Persian diplomacy to the Sultan of Bijapur, addressing him for a whole page with titles such as Son of the Sky of State, Gem and Mirror of Purity, Asylum of Grandeur, the great Lord to whom the angelic mind of His Majesty the Emperor is very attentive, and in the end, referring to him as Khan or nobleman, but never as Sultan or king. The Sultan replied with suitable humility, calling the emperor the protector of the world, vice regent of God, lord of felicity, O Solomon, etc. etc. The Mughal sent the Sultan a present of a horse, and there was an enraptured acknowledgement. This horse, a moon in beauty, touched the heaven like the imagination of an astronomer. Over his haunches is a saddle cloth of Turkish velvet. He is a true Persian. He wanders in the woods like Majnun. His tail is more lovely than the locks of Laila. When yet another letter arrived from the emperor, the Sultan placed it respectfully on his head and professed to have inspired by the very touch of it. Sorry, to have been inspired by the very touch of it. I became so exalted that I can hope for nothing better. The end of all those elegant exchanges was a treaty in 1637 by the terms of which the Sultan acknowledged Shah Jahan as suzerain and agreed to pay tribute. The boundary between the empire and Bijapur was drawn just north of the tract of land which had been granted to Shivaji's grandfather Maloji. As soon as the war was over, Shahaji sent to call his son and wife to Bijapur. So, for the first time, Shivaji left the hill country where he had spent his vagabond childhood. It must have been a melancholy journey through districts ruined by the war, burnt villages and crumbling towns, temples deliberately defaced and defiled, a few trees, smoke blackened and stunted, and then miles and miles of empty, uninhabited land, rolling yellow downs, ochre spear grass, sighing in the wind. It was only as they approached Bijapur city that they came upon evidence of life and prosperity. Here there were gardens and canals and orchards, and white mosques and groves of mango. And lifting their eyes, the travelers would have seen in the distance a line of domes and towers along the sky. Bijapur, the Indian Palmyra. Chapter 3. Probably the first thing that struck a visitor to Bijapur was the symbol of the crescent which was displayed on every public building. He would learn that this was the family crest of the dynasty of Bijapur, who boasted relationship with the caliphs at Constantinople and so had mimicked them in the use of the crescent. Since the other Musalman rulers in India, from the emperor downwards, were of Indo Persian or Central Asian descent, this solitary ruling family of Ottoman blood is interesting and worth a short digression on its origins. The Osmanli, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, proclaimed Sultan on the field of Kosovo, fatal to Serbia, had ordered the execution of his younger brother to avoid even the possibility of a rival. From this single savage impulse arose the precedent followed at the proclamation of each succeeding Turkish Sultan. All royal princes except the heir were slaughtered so that no dynastic feuds should disturb the new reign. In 1451, Muhammad II, to become known as the Conqueror, decreed on his accession the usual massacre. His youngest brother, a child called Yusuf, was the favorite son of their mother. She begged from the new Sultan a day's respite for Yusuf. This was granted. It happened that a merchant called Gargastani was then at the court disposing of Georgian slaves. The Sultana sent for Gargastani by night, bought from him a Georgian lad of the same age as her son, and handed over Yusuf to him with a sum of money in return for his promise to bring up the young prince in his own home. Then she caused the Georgian slave to be strangled, and when the executioners came at dawn, she showed them the corpse of a boy and pretended it was that of her son, whom she had preferred to have killed rather than relinquished to the common executioners. Whether she added to her explanations a bribe or whether the executioners were tired of their work, this not very probable story was accepted, and the body of the Georgian changeling was taken in funeral pomp through the city. Meanwhile, the merchant Gargastrini returned to his house in Save with the young prince. Had the Sultana remained content with her ruse, we should never have heard of the story, and Yusuf would have grown up in Save as apprentice to his master, ending perhaps as a prosperous slave dealer like him. But his mother could not forget him, and once a year she sent a messenger to Save for news about her son. In an oriental court, no one's secrets are safe. Soon there were whispers about the Sultana's unaccountable interest in a remote town. The governor of Save was told to inquire. Yusuf, warned in time, fled eastwards through Persia to India, which he reached in 1459. Penniless and friendless, he was trapped by a slave dealer and sold to a noble in central India, Mahmud Gawan. A clever, handsome boy, he soon gained his master's favor, and presently Mahmud Gawan adopted him as his son. Now, Mahmud Gawan was an officer in the service of the Bahmani king who, it will be remembered, ruled over central India. One day he fell into disfavors and the king ordered his execution. He was duly beheaded, but Yusuf, escaping from the court, appealed to the regiments which Mahmud Gawan had commanded. They acclaimed him as Mahmud's heir and offered to march against the king. At the head of an army, Yusuf extorted from the king the governorship of Bijapur. Governor and soon independent prince, he founded for himself a kingdom. His successors built and beautified their capital till it became one of the most splendid cities in Asia. You must imagine Shah, sorry, you must imagine Shivaji's awe as he rode in under the north. Sorry, you must imagine Shivaji's awe as he rode in under the great north gate over which ran the proud inscription. The Sultan, whose orders are current in the seven regions, has erected a rampart worthy of Alexander and stared up at the gigantic walls and bastions, which even today in their ruin are of cyclopean proportions. Along the walls were the guns for which the city was famous for it for its rulers had brought with them a Turkish interest and skill in artillery. Fantastic in design and adorned with precious stones, these guns were treated as though they were fetishes. Troops on the march saluted them, and they were protected from the sun by umbrellas of state. Greatest of all the guns was one called Malik-e-Maidan, which means monarch of the plain. It had been constructed by the famous artillerist Khan Murad, who caused to be cut on one side the inscription, phrased as though in answer to a challenge: Hast thou tried me, O apostle of Allah? And on the other, the more complacent: I have subdued this monarch. Its muzzle was so big that a man could sit inside. It was fashioned like the head of a dragon with open jaws and fangs bared. The ears of the dragon were drilled for the insertion of earrings. This gun was held in such esteem that the Sultan kept it covered with cloth of gold and once a year came in solemn procession to do it reverence. Even today, its trappings and adornments gone, lying along the ruined walls like a stranded veil, it is worshipped by the people who smear it with red lead and scented oil, hang garlands about its neck, and bowing before the monstrous jaws, offer upon brass trays handfuls of rose petals. Passing through the gateway, Shivaji and his mother must have gazed at the mosques and palaces and tombs. There was the Gol Gumbaz, with its honey colored dome, the largest dome in the world, its walls covered with lapis lazuli inscribed in great gold letters with the tomb of Sultan Muhammad, whose abode is in paradise. And there was the Ibrahim Rauja, more lovely than all the white Mughal buildings of the north, with its slim minarets from which hung an incredible number of stone chains as delicately carved as silver filigree work, clanking together in the warm wind. All round the building were gardens with groves of blossoming trees and rivulets of cold clear water sighing down channels of colored marble. The gloom under the dome that was like an opal bubble were the tombs of the sultans and their wives. A man's grave would have on it a large white pen case to show that the man had been scholarly in his lifetime, for this quality was considered estimable in a man but not in a woman. The women's graves were flat topped with flattering epitaphs written on them. That of Queen Taj Sultana, for whom the mausoleum had been originally raised, read, dignified and exalted as Solomon's queen Bilqis, kindly and affable, the very diadem of modesty. When she left this realm, she ascended to heaven. And over the north door, under the fan of the most delicately carved marble, the architect Malik Sandal had written, with a certain lack of modesty, heaven stood astounded at this building. The garden of paradise has borrowed its beauty from this garden, and every column here is as graceful as the cypress trees in the garden of purity. An angel from heaven cried out, "This building which rejoices the heart of is a fitting memorial to Queen Taj Sultana." Perhaps the most astonishing building of all was the Palace of the Relic, an edifice raised to house a silver casket in which were two hairs of the Prophet Muhammad. Italian artists had been charted, sorry, Italian artists had been chartered by the Sultan to cover the walls with bright frescoes. It will be remembered how stern is the Islamic ban on all representations of the human form. But such old fashioned superstitions did not concern the dilettante Sultan. Strange, and to the Orthodox Muslim North most horrifying, were the subjects these Italian painters chose. They painted scenes at a dinner party where the women sat crowned with flowers, eating fruit from dishes of Venetian glass, while slave girls played on organs, violas, and harps. They painted European gentlemen in wide hats and lace collars with dogs at their heels. And here was a Venus, rose crowned, with pearls at her neck, a plump Veronese figure leaning back languidly, while Cupid, with blue wings, a jeweled belt, bracelets, and pearl earrings, held a mirror before her face. Mars, a winged helmet in one hand, raised his other hand in amorous appeal to the Queen of Love. In a garden, Venus sported with Adonis. A Persian musician recited poetry to a group of ladies, some European and some Oriental. He rolled his head to attract attention, but the ladies chatted happily together, ignoring him. In most quarters of the town were public baths, for the dynasty had brought from Brusa and Nicaea Byzantine conceptions of luxury. There was one open air bathing pool, and over the gateway was this inscription: "A lovely pool. Its water is bright and pure, clearer than a well in paradise, sweeter than rose water, its every bubble like the moon." Other baths were covered, the walls lined with chunam, fluted and painted, the vaulted domes powdered with mother of pearl. And down all the main streets were fountains for the poor to drink at. Their inscriptions still remain. The glorious and powerful Sultan, whose court is as gorgeous as Solomon's, has made this fountain in order that the thirsty may drink therefrom and may then keep their tongues swift with prayers for the ever enduring reign of the Sultan, who is the asylum of the universe. luxury, refinement, and buildings of exquisite art. But in few kingdoms have violent deaths been more frequent. Processions of execution were as frequent as processions of holiday and festival. Under the famous baobab tree, 50 feet in girth, bare of foliage, with gaunt, gnarled branches and bloated trunk, Abyssinian executioners awaited their victims. When the condemned men approached, the Abyssinians salaamed to them before unsheathing their heavy swords. The nobles who passed Shivaji in the thronged streets, their retainers thrusting aside his mother's shabby palanquin, their kettle drums and gold fringed umbrellas advertising the approach of a person of consequence. These nobles lived lives of tension and suspense, uneasy at each rumor and suspicious of each other. There were bitter discussions even in the palace, and disputes between courtiers often assumed the conditions of civil war, and all were subject to the caprice of the Sultan or of that one of his ever changing ministers who for the moment was in favor. One of these nobles was Shivaji's father, Shahaji. He had prospered as a soldier in Bijapur service and seems to have lost all interest in his lands near the Mughal border. A handsome man, but florid and stout, in his fine darbar robes, only distinguishable as a Hindu by the red caste mark on his forehead. He was contented enough with his place in the hierarchy of Bijapur officialdom, and if the Muhammadan courtiers often intrigued against him, he had been able so far to rely on the Sultan's favor. He had married a second wife, a younger woman than Jijabai, and one more suited than she to his temperament. By her he had a son named Vyankoji, of whom we shall not hear again till the end of Shivaji's life. This second marriage should not, according to Hindu ideas, have greatly embittered Jijabai, nor offered any excuse to Shahji to treat her with any diminished respect and affection. But it seems clear that Shahji had never loved Jijabai. A sudden childish impulse and his father's quick ambition, these had brought Shahji into a loveless marriage, and he seems to have felt an increasing aversion to Jijabai. Now, after several years of separation, he must have found her even more out of sympathy with him than when they first lived together. So hardened had her character become. She was no longer beautiful. She was embittered by her trials. She did not conceal her disquiet and disease in the enervating atmosphere of the Islamic city. Shahji had not summoned her to Bijapur for the sake of her company, but so that she could bring his son with her. He felt responsible for the boy's upbringing and wanted him to have a suitable career in the Bijapur service where his own influence could ensure him proper advancement. Moreover, there was his marriage to be arranged. At once, Jijabai protested that she would not consent to her son's marriage in Bijapur, lest Muslims defile the ceremony by their presence. Mother and father struggled for their son's allegiance, but Shivaji could not be separated from his mother. He hardly knew his father, and all the rigid Hindu tradition of unquestioning obedience to the head of the family counted for nothing against the memory of his mother's devotion to him, of her loneliness and her capture by the Mughals, and his father's abandonment of her. Shivaji was torn between two feelings for his precocious, stubborn son. He admired the extraordinary intelligence of the boy, for we are told that Shivaji, instead of playing with other children, would pester his father with questions about affairs of state, methods of administration, and the management of armies. At the same time, he was exasperated by Shivaji's disrespect for Muhammadan authorities. For instance, there was his behavior at the Darbar. Shahji took his son to pay his respects to the Sultan as the first move in introducing him into the life of the court. They entered the great gate of the palace and passed through the outer courts. Here was an edifice known as the Water Pavilion, a tall tower rising from a pool, with balconies made of fretted wood and five light projecting windows and a parapet of carved lotus petals. The courtiers sat on these balconies on warm evenings and were refreshed by the spray of water spouting from dolphin shaped pipes and falling in silver rain upon the pool below. Along the walls of the palace were paintings of various Bijapur notables, especially of Muhammad the Sixth Sultan. He was represented reclining on a couch with his favorite dancing girl. Beside him were a basket of flowers, a lute, and a Persian book. The portrait was very lifelike, and the long dead prince seemed to smile and nod. Within the Darbar hall, the Sultan of Bijapur sat on a low throne, one leg crossed under him, the other outstretched with foot resting on a globe. In one hand, he held a gold key, in the other, a sword. He wore an embroidered mitre and a tartar coat, frogged and brocaded, and high boots painted with convolvulus flowers. An enormous umbrella of state was held over his head. Courteous, courteous wielded gold handled fry whisks, and on either side of the throne, leaf shaped fans rose and fell. As the courtiers in turn approached the throne, they prostrated themselves, bowing their turbans to the carpet. Shahaji followed their example. But his young son, without bowing, saluted the Sultan with the Maratha salam, such as he had seen his own people greet their superiors with in villages of the hill country. The simple manly gesture of raising both hands with palms together to the level of the chin. What at first what at first the scandalized courtiers took to be the gaucherie of a rustic turned out to be a piece of obstinate defiance. Shivaji could not be persuaded to approach the Sultan's throne in the prescribed manner, and it is said that only the high favor which his father then enjoyed at court saved Shivaji from immediate punishment. After this regrettable incident, Shaji began to lose interest in the child. It was clear he would never be a success at court. He seemed to have inherited more than a fair share of his mother's character. So Shivaji was left more and more to himself and to his mother. I suppose that if Shahaji had taken a little more trouble over his son and had set himself to influence him through affection and sympathy, and perhaps even more if he had been fully reconciled with Jijabai and shown her the consideration that was her due, then Shivaji would probably have surrendered in time to the charm of the feudal life of Bijapur and settled down in it happily enough, gradually forgetting his childhood and his earliest impressions. His brother Sambhaji, 4 years older than Shivaji, having lived in Bijapur while Shivaji and his mother were hiding in the hills, seems to have had no other ambition than loyally to serve the Bijapur government. He entered the Sultan's army and met his death some years later in an obscure skirmish in the far south. But Shahaji seems to have soon lost patience with Shivaji, and the boy wandered alone about the city, the bright country trained eyes picking out all the details of the life around him. The streets devoted to luxury trades, perfumers, barbers, painters, the brass workers hammering out the great vessels for which Bijapur was famous, working naked to the waist, the sun gleaming on the purple brown backs, while a tame gazelle, the usual pet of the brass workers' guild, ran delicately between their ranks, the rest houses for the free accommodation of travelers, so luxuriously appointed that men said of them, to rest therein was for the weary to taste the medicine of felicity. There were European merchants in those rest houses, and Shivaji, who in later life showed so eager a curiosity about the West, must have looked with interest at the foreigners in their strange attire, their wigs, the feathers in their wide hats, their slashed silk clothes, and heavy heeled shoes. But these foreigners, for all their fine clothes, were easily outshone by the nobles of Bijapur, who rode past Shivaji, having adorned their elephants, horses, and lances with silver bells and feathers, gallant and rich in apparel and sombreros. They will miss of a booty rather than a dinner, must mount in a state and have their arms carried before them and their women not far behind them, with the masters of mirth and jollity. End of quote. Nor were these only soldiers and courtiers, for even the merchants, quote, imitate a noble pomp and are not encountered abroad. Nisi magna comitante caterva, without a great train, using many orders in the hammams or balneos. Nor are they without oils, perfumes, and essences of sandal, cloves, and oranges, which are in their kind very exquisitely drawn off. They go rich in apparel, their turbans of gold, damasked gold atlas coats to their heels, embroidered sashes and slippers, silver and gold caparisons on their horses, which are of Arabia, Persia, or Turkey. Jostling the trains of merchants and officials were bands of wild fakirs wearing a patched coat of a saffron color with a pretended careless neglect of the world, and no certain residents of this order are many the most dissolute, licentious, and profane persons in the world, committing sodomy, will be drunk with bung and curse God and Muhammad. But under this disguise, many pass as spies up and down and reap the best intelligence for the benefit of the prince that employs them. End of quote. Behind the splendid facade of the city's life, the display of the cautious, insolent, and stubborn, and not easily bridled, the apparently universal reverence shown to the Sultan, who was as Caesar to the Romans or Pharaoh to the Egyptians, there was a darker side to life in Bijapur. Apart from the violent tenor of life inevitable in such a society, it was obvious that the majority of the Sultan's Hindu subjects were oppressed intermittently but irritatingly. Even if friars comment that the movement domineer over the Indians most insufferably were an exaggeration, it seems clear that, with the exception of a few nobles like Shahaji, who were happy in high office, the mass of Hindus were made to feel they were an inferior race. But they had long acquiesced in this and had even grown resigned to the parade of Muhammadan customs that should be abhorrent to Hindus. So there was all the greater astonishment at the news that young Shivaji had made a public protest against cow slaughter, which was the occasion for riot in which Muhammadan butchers were attacked. Shivaji again. Shahaji felt his own position compromised by the boy's defiant behavior. He ordered Jijabai to take Shivaji away from Bijapur and to return to their ancestral estates on the Mughal frontier. If Shivaji looked back at the palaces and temples of the city, it cannot have been with great regret. He was never happier than when alone with his mother, and his stay in Bijapur can hardly have provided him with many happy memories. He only returned to Bijapur the year before his death, and then in very different circumstances. Chapter 4. It is not uncommon for a strong new power to rise on the frontier districts between two large but decrepit states. An obvious instance is the sudden emergence of the Ottomans on the border country between the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Emirates. Nor is it uncommon for the large states to be ruined less by any positive superiority of the new power rising between them than by their mutually destructive animosity. The success of the Arabs against both Persian and Roman empires is a case in point. So it is necessary to emphasize the geographical situation of Shivaji's family estates on the very borders of both Bijapur and the Mughal dominions. For this strip of land, given to Shivaji's grandfather by a Mohammedan prince in a gesture reminiscent of the Arabian Nights, was in fact to prove the core of a new empire. When the Bijapur authorities learned that Shivaji's troublesome son had been sent so far away, they must have been relieved. At such a distance, nothing that the lad did could be of much importance, and anyway, he would be properly chastised by the military officers of the border country. It could not have occurred to them that, in certain circumstances, his very distance from Bijapur was an advantage to him. Then there was his proximity to the Mughal border. No help could be expected from the imperial forces. For, in spite of treaties and affirmations of alliance, there was little sympathy between the Puritan unifying North and Bijapur with its Shia sultans, its dilettantism and un Islamic observances, its recurrent pretensions to independent sovereignty. But at the time of Shivaji's return from Bijapur, all such considerations would have appeared fantastic. So far from causing trouble to any government, it seemed improbable that Shivaji and his mother would be able to live on their lands. These lands, crossed and recrossed by armies of mercenaries, had been reduced to a wilderness. Most of the villages had disappeared, and there were few fields left in cultivation, and fewer men to cultivate them. Ruined and desperate, many of the peasants had become brigands and raided the occasional caravans that came that way. Following the ravages of armies had come the famine of 1631 to 32, one of the most terrible that Western India had yet experienced. And as men declined in numbers, the wild beasts increased. Wolves became an intolerable scourge. They invaded villages in packs, and the starving peasants were almost helpless against them. Shivaji was now 30. His father had appointed as his tutor and steward a Brahmin of the district called Dadaji Kondadev. To many English people, there is something faintly sinister about the word Brahmin. It suggests priestcraft, obscurantism, and subtlety. And certain visitors to India have, in their subsequent travel books, attributed to the Brahman caste a variety of unattractive qualities. But those who have known intimately and lived with Brahman families would certainly agree that whatever their faults, the Brahmins of Western India impress one as scholarly and courteous, devoted and most loyal friends, their family life of a singular sweetness, yet disciplined by rigid attachment to their exacting faith. Grave, lean men with long heads and light colored eyes, their women of extreme grace and often great beauty. Of the Brahman aristocracy, Shivaji's tutor was a fine example. His devotion had become proverbial. His one passion was the service of his young master. He was punctilious almost to eccentricity in his honesty. In illustration of this, the following story is told. He had caused an orchard to be planted on Shivaji's estate, and he warned the servants that anyone who stole fruit from the trees would be punished. One day he himself was standing in the orchard at noon. He was thirsty, and without thinking, he stretched out his hand and picked a ripe mango which swung tantalizingly before him. A moment later, he remembered the warning he had addressed to the servants. He fell into an agony of remorse, imagining that people would say that he was as ready to see that other people kept their hands off his master's property as he was to use it for his own purposes. He called for a sword and prepared to hack off the offending hand. The servants crowded round him and weeping tried to dissuade him from so extravagant a self punishment. Even though he laid his sword aside, he wore hereafter a coat without a sleeve for his right arm. If this action, so often quoted in India, sounds affected and theatrical to English readers, it should be remembered that in medieval Europe, where the tenor of life was as melodramatic and the emotional atmosphere as highly charged as in Mughal India, such a gesture of remorse and penitence would have been neither strange nor unusual. Dadaji was not only a saint and scholar, he was also a capable administrator. He devoted himself to restoring the estate to something of its former prosperity. He started with the wolf plague offering a reward from his own savings for each wolf killed. The hillmen found wolf killing more paying than raids on an occasional caravan and soon cleared the country of wolves. Then Dadaji tried to tempt back to their fields the peasants who had fled to the woods and to a life of banditry. He offered good land to them at graded rates, a nominal rental of 1 rupee for the first year, 3 rupees for the second, and so up to 20 rupees in the sixth year. Many of the tribesmen of the hills were attracted by this offer, left their forests and mountain villages, and settled down in Shivaji's estate to become in time his enthusiastic adherents. Dadaji recruited other hillmen as armed guards to protect the countryside from brigands. For the first time for many years, the villagers knew relief from constant peril. Confidence returned. Houses began to be built. Sorry, Houses began to be rebuilt and in temples were worshipped. Sorry. Houses began to be rebuilt and in temples were whispered grateful prayers. The chief village in Shivaji's lands was Pune, spelled Pune. This place has attained fame as the locus classicus of Anglo-Indian yarns. But one must dismiss all such preconceptions and realize that 300 years ago, Pune was a small village known only for its temples and orthodoxy of their priests. At the time of Shivaji's return from Bijapur, even these temples were in ruins. The village had several times been looted and was now entirely deserted, save by a few fisher folk who lived along the river Muta. When the river, when the last Mohammedan force had passed that way, the commander caused all the houses and walls to be pulled down, and with a final gesture of resentful contempt, ordered a team of asses to be harnessed to a plough and driven over the foundations. Then, solemnly cursing the site of the Hindu town, he planted an iron rod in the earth as a symbol of his malediction. Dadaji now dug up this iron rod and threw it away. But he realized that the memory of the curse would remain with the superstitious villagers, so he replied to the gesture of the Muhammadan commander by one that was even more dramatic. He had the site ploughed over once again, but this time with white oxen drawing a plough of pure gold. From a site deserted and shunned, Pune became rapidly a prosperous town. One day it would be the Antioch of Hindu India. To measure the change, one may look forward to the days of its splendor and quote the impression of an English visitor, Robertson. Vast wealth poured into Pune from many causes, the intrigues of foreign powers, and the deference shown to the Peshwa or chief minister by the Maratha leaders. The city was bright with armed men, handsome horses, rich palanquins, and gorgeous houses. Messengers ran from place to place, all was gay with sport, dances, and merrymaking. But in spite of its wealth and frequent holidays and festivals, Pune was known for its peaceful, orderly life. Foreigners remarked on the sensible, sober character of the people. Even in the last decade of Maratha independence, a period clouded by increasing anarchy and confusion, Elphinstone, the last British minister to the Maratha government, wrote of Pune. On the whole, murders and robberies attended with violence and alarm were very rare, and I have never heard any complaints of the insecurity of property. Dadaji could not foresee that the little village for whose prosperity he did so much would one day be the capital of India, but it was his patient administration that laid the foundations of Pune's greatness. He raised on the bank of the river a mansion for Shivaji and his mother. They called it the Rang Mahal or Painted Palace. A Maratha house is generally built round two courtyards. The front courtyard, having a pillared colonnade round it with an archway to the street, is used for the reception of strangers and the recreation of the men of the household. The back courtyard, used generally by the women, has an altar in the center planted with sacred basil. In the front colonnade, the men will recline in the evenings. Servants bring oil lamps, the company rising to salute with lifted hands the yellow flames which are thought to be a symbol of life. This must have been the happiest moment of the day for Dadaji. Rest after long hours wrestling with the business of the estate. Rest and leisurely perusal of his scrolls of Sanskrit verse. The quiet of evening, the soft lamplight, the black square Sanskrit characters opening up worlds of beauty. Presently, he would call Shivaji, and the boy squatted down beside him while he recited the sonorous couplets of old epics, telling of the heroes of Hindustan. And Shivaji sat entranced while the lamp flames quivered in the night wind. Sorry, while the lamp flames quivered in the while the lamp flames quivered in the night wind, and great moths stumbled about the carved pillars of the colonnade, and the dreams that had haunted him from his earliest childhood became fixed in a passionate ambition. When still only 15, he had a seal prepared for himself with this inscription: although the first moon is small, men know that it will grow great. This seal befits Shivaji. As though to prepare himself for the long ordeal of his life, Shivaji spent his days in arduous exercise. He gathered round him a band of hillmen, and with them wandered over the same hills where he had spent those perilous years of his childhood. In the ravines where he had then stumbled wearily, he now strode as master. He loved, as all his life, to subject himself to every strain, to test his strength to the utmost. He followed lonely paths where even his companions hesitated to follow. He scrambled along the rocky ledges of sheer cliffs, sending eagles and yellow vultures screaming from their nests. In time, he came to know every mile of that wild hill country as familiarly as his own house in Pune. And the hillmen, at first peering distrustfully from their stockaded villages at rumors of a stranger, presently came to greet him with admiration. He had a smile for all of them, and we know from all who recorded their impressions of him how attractive his smile was. These hillmen were one day to form the backbone of the Maratha army. After a long day in the forests, Shivaji would return to Pune, the hills violet behind him, and before him the rolling yellow fields. As every Hindu does, he would go first to his mother on returning to the house. At that hour, she would be worshipping Vishnu before the altar in the center of the inner courtyard. The altar was planted with sacred basil. She walked slowly round the altar, a lamp in her hand, a golden petal of lamplight in the gathering darkness. When her prayers were over, she would talk with Shivaji. They were so much together that they understood each other like lovers. Presently, he would leave her for supper, for in a Hindu family, the men and women eat apart. His supper, a little salted rice and milk or a few maize cakes, would be served in the colonnade of the front courtyard, Shivaji reclining against a column, the little pile of rice set on a plantain leaf before him, and all round the leaf the maid servants had drawn designs in colored chalk. And after supper, his studies with Dadaji. So the years passed, and Shivaji grew to manhood. He was by European standards short, but he was broad and very strongly built. His arms were unusually long. He let his beard and moustache grow, and from under his turban, a lock of curled hair hung down on one side of his face. His eyes were very fine and contrasted in their soft and melancholy beauty with the curved aquiline nose. The Frenchman, Thévenot, wrote of him: Ce raja est petit et basané, avec des yeux vifs qui marquent beaucoup d'esprit. The English chaplain of Bombay described him as erect and of an excellent proportion, active in exercise, and whenever he speaks, he seems to smile. He has a quick and piercing eye. Part 2, Rebel. Okay, we'll do part 2 in the next video. So we'll end it here. Okay, it looks like while Shivaji was raised by the servants of his mother, I guess it looks like Dennis Kincaid was raised by Tilak. Almost he seems to be have become a Tilak's rebel and admired Tilak or whatever, or other people, we don't know what, or probably his rebellious young mind seems to have identified with the Kshatriyas and Brahmins, oh, that to the valorous and martial Brahmins of Maharashtra. Okay, so I should read the biography of Kincaid, who this Kincaid actually was. Actually, he doesn't look like a civil servant. This whole book doesn't look like having been written by a civil servant. It looks more like something written by probably a merchant's son or a clergyman's son, or I don't know who this Kincaid was. Should check out who this Kincaid is.